So let's break this down, because when you look at what's going on with the war in Iran and the way it's being talked about, there's a pattern that matters. It's not just what happened. It's how it's explained, or in this case, how it isn't explained. First off, we have to acknowledge something pretty basic when a president orders a major military operation, one that costs lives, money, and geopolitical stability. You should expect a clear reason for doing it. Not a slogan, not a tweet, not a talking point, a reason. Something that explains why this is happening. And right now, there just isn't one that sticks. The explanations have swung from existential threat to Iran might take over the Middle East, all without solid evidence, to now suggesting the conflict might end, when I feel it in my bones. That's not clarity, that's confusion. Now let's talk about the endgame, the strategy for how this stops. Wars have beginnings, sure. Wars also need endings. Diplomacy, conditions, criteria, something besides, we'll keep going until we're done, but what counts as done? Is it decimating Iran's military, a regime change, or restoring regional stability? Even those closest to the administration are saying different things. If the public can't distill a consistent objective from public statements, that's more than a messaging problem. It's a strategic one. Here's where the so-called Epstein file factor comes in, because timing and narrative matter in politics. In late February, as millions of pages of files related to Jeffrey Epstein were circulating, and yes, that included politically sensitive material and allegations, attention was high. Then suddenly the headlines shifted hard to missiles and military strikes. Some lawmakers weren't shy about saying the timing looked like a distraction. A significant portion of the public, by some polls, actually believes that the war's outbreak may have served to draw focus away from that controversy, at least temporarily. Now, to be clear, there's a difference between saying, this is definitively the reason, and saying, this is part of how the story has been perceived. And in the public conversation, perception often is reality. When you see comedy hosts, commentators, and critics all making that same link between the war and the Epstein files, even if they're joking, it signals something. People are trying to make sense of why the administration hasn't answered the simpler questions about strategy and goals. Think about it like this: if you start a war, but you can't coherently explain why you began it or how you intend to end it, guess what fills the vacuum? People start filling it with their own theories. And because politics and media are so intertwined, those theories spread fast. And that's the educational takeaway here. Leadership communication isn't just talk, it shapes how citizens understand major decisions. When communication is inconsistent, people don't just remain uninformed, they become suspicious. And that's exactly why a situation like this, where the why and the how are both unclear, creates an opening for alternate explanations, whether they're fair, ground or not. In short, understanding wars and the narratives around them means paying attention not just to bombs and battalions, but to messages, timing, and the gaps in explanation. Because those gaps don't stay empty for long, something always rushes in to fill them. And most of the time, that something tells you almost as much about public trust as it does about the actual policy choices themselves. When you look at the start of the conflict with Iran, one of the first things that jumps out is how inconsistent and vague the rationale has been. In any responsible leadership scenario, when a major military action is taken, something that involves the lives of soldiers and civilians, billions of dollars in resources, and long-term consequences for international relations, you would expect a clear, evidence-based justification. But in this case, the explanations that have come from the highest levels of leadership have been shifting almost week to week. At first, it was framed as a direct response to a threat to American personnel and interests in the region, though the evidence presented publicly was thin and often contradicted by intelligence experts or independent analysts. Then, almost immediately, the narrative pivoted to more general claims about Iran's destabilizing influence across the Middle East, focusing on proxy militias and alleged weapons programs, but without clarifying exactly why a full-scale military response was necessary right at that moment. What this creates is a situation where the public is left to parse statements that are both politically charged and factually incomplete. It's not just that the reasoning seems inconsistent, it's that the leadership has repeatedly presented multiple, sometimes contradictory justifications in a very short time span. One day it's about defending American lives, the next day it's about strategic dominance in the region, and then suddenly it becomes about making Iran pay a price, which is an abstract concept rather than a concrete policy goal. This kind of shifting messaging undermines trust and makes it difficult for both domestic and international audiences to understand the true motivations behind the conflict. Experts on military policy and international relations point out that this lack of clarity isn't just a communications problem, it can also have real consequences on the ground. When allies, enemies, and even members of one's own administration are unsure of the underlying rationale, coordination becomes more difficult, and decision-making risks being driven by reactionary impulses rather than a coherent strategy. In addition, the public is left to interpret the motives on its own, often turning to speculation, partisan narratives, or conspiracy theories to fill the void. In the absence of a clear, consistent rationale, the perception of the war can become as important as the war itself, influencing public opinion, political support, and even the morale of military personnel. One of the most significant issues with the conflict in Iran is not just how it began, but the fact that there has been almost no clear articulation of an endgame. Wars, by nature, are complex, but even the most complicated military operations generally have defined objectives, the conditions that would constitute success, milestones for progress, and an overall strategy for resolution. In this case, however, the messaging around the conflict has been inconsistent and at times contradictory, leaving the public, policymakers, and even military personnel uncertain about what constitutes victory or what the administration actually hopes to achieve. At times, statements have implied that success is measured by Iran being weakened or deterred, while at other times the focus seems to be on regime change, which raises questions about feasibility, international legality, and potential unintended consequences. This lack of specificity turns what should be a strategic conversation into a muddled narrative, where it is difficult to distinguish between tactical moves and long-term objectives. The absence of a clear endgame also makes it challenging to assess whether actions taken in the field are proportional or effective. If the public does not understand the goals, any progress that is reported can appear arbitrary or incomplete. For example, strikes against specific military targets or political leaders are sometimes framed as decisive, but without context, it is unclear how these actions contribute to the ultimate resolution of the conflict. This creates space for speculation and criticism, as observers attempt to determine whether there is a coherent strategy or simply reactive decision-making based on immediate events. Analysts and foreign policy experts have repeatedly emphasized that wars without clearly defined objectives tend to drift, often resulting in prolonged engagement and escalating costs, both in terms of human lives and geopolitical stability. Communication inconsistencies compound the problem. In speeches, press briefings, and interviews, the rhetoric around ending the conflict has fluctuated. One moment it is suggested that negotiations could bring a quick resolution, the next moment the idea of an indefinite military presence or pressure campaign is highlighted. This lack of continuity creates confusion domestically and internationally, signaling to allies and adversaries alike that the leadership may not have fully thought through the sequence of steps needed to achieve strategic goals. The public, meanwhile, is left to interpret mixed messages, sometimes relying on speculation, partisan media, or leaks to understand what the administration is trying to accomplish. This ambiguity can undermine trust in leadership, as citizens struggle to reconcile claims of decisive action with the reality of unclear objectives, making it difficult to evaluate progress or hold decision-makers accountable. Timing matters in politics almost as much as the actions themselves, and the start of the conflict with Iran coincided with a period of renewed public attention on the Jeffrey Epstein files. These files, which include court records, allegations, and investigative documents, have been politically sensitive and have implicated figures across a broad spectrum of power and influence. The resurfacing or release of these documents generated intense media coverage and public interest, placing significant scrutiny on the political establishment. In this context, the timing of military action in Iran has drawn attention because it shifted the news cycle and changed the focus of public discussion. When headlines move from controversial documents involving powerful individuals to missile strikes and international conflict, the national conversation and media narratives can be redirected, intentionally or not. This creates a situation where timing itself becomes part of the strategic landscape, affecting perception, public discourse, and political calculation. Experts in media and political strategy have often noted that the overlap between high-profile domestic controversies and international events is rarely coincidental in political life. Leaders and advisors understand that attention is finite. The public and media can focus intensely on only a few major stories at a time. When Epstein-related disclosures were prominent, the subsequent escalation of tensions with Iran drew coverage away from domestic legal and political debates, effectively reshaping the narrative environment. Even if the conflict's timing was driven by other strategic or security considerations, the coinciding emergence of Epstein files naturally influences interpretation, leading to speculation about whether one event was used to overshadow the other. Analysts point out that this dynamic is common in politics. Major international developments often coincide with domestic controversies, which can create a perception of distraction or media manipulation. From a public perception standpoint, the combination of the Epstein files and military escalation introduces an interpretive challenge. Citizens, journalists, and commentators must separate unrelated events from those that may have strategic linkage, often without access to full information. When these events occur concurrently, uncertainty increases and competing narratives emerge. Some observers suggest that timing may have been leveraged intentionally or unintentionally to reduce attention on politically damaging material. Others argue that national security events are unpredictable and require immediate response, meaning the overlap may be coincidental but still influential in shaping the story. Regardless of intent, the simultaneous focus on the Epstein files and Iran-related conflict highlights how timing can magnify political and media effects, influencing both the perception of urgency and the framing of decisions made by leadership. One of the more controversial aspects of the Iran conflict is the discussion around what political analysts and commentators have called the distraction theory. The idea is straightforward. When a major, potentially damaging domestic issue arises, like the resurfacing of the Jeffrey Epstein files, there can be strong incentive for political leaders to shift public attention to a completely different topic, often something dramatic or urgent, such as a military conflict. The theory itself doesn't claim that all actions are orchestrated purely for distraction, but it suggests that timing, messaging, and narrative framing can be influenced by the desire to redirect public focus. In this case, the argument is that the outbreak of military tension with heightened media scrutiny on Epstein-related controversies, and this overlap has fueled speculation about whether one event may have served to overshadow the other. From a historical perspective, using international events or national security crises to divert attention is not new in politics. Leaders have long understood that public attention is limited and that dramatic events, especially those involving foreign policy or military action, can dominate headlines in a way that domestic controversies rarely can. The distraction theory in this context gained traction because it fits a broader pattern of observation. The Iran conflict became a dominant narrative just as sensitive files related to Epstein were being discussed widely, raising the question of whether the timing was coincidental or strategically convenient. In public debate, this theory has been referenced repeatedly by journalists, pundits, and social commentators who highlight that when domestic scandals overlap with international crises, media coverage can shift abruptly and public discourse follows suit. It's important to emphasize that the distraction theory is primarily about perception rather than confirmed intent. Analysts stress that public perception matters because if citizens believe that a foreign policy decision is being used to distract from domestic controversy, trust in leadership can erode, regardless of whether the action was actually intended as a diversion. Polls, social media discussions, and opinion pieces from multiple outlets reflected this exact dynamic, showing that many Americans were making the connection between the Iran conflict and the Epstein files, even if there was no direct evidence linking the two. This perception becomes part of the narrative itself, influencing how people evaluate government actions, question official explanations, and interpret the motives behind major decisions. The discussion around distraction theory also highlights a broader point about media and politics. In an age where news cycles are instantaneous and attention spans are fragmented, the interaction between domestic controversies and international events has become increasingly significant. The public is constantly interpreting signals, patterns, and coincidences, often drawing conclusions about strategy and intent even when explicit explanations are missing, which shapes political debate, trust, and engagement. Another critical aspect of the Iran conflict is the clear disconnect in strategic communication coming from the administration. Leadership in any military or political scenario requires a coherent and consistent message that explains not only what is happening, but why it is happening and what the intended outcomes are. Without that clarity, domestic and international audiences are left confused, making it difficult to build trust or predict next steps. In this situation, the statements surrounding the conflict have frequently conflicted with each other. At times, officials have described the conflict as nearly concluded, with success already achieved or imminent, while at other times the rhetoric has implied that decisive action and further escalation are still required. This inconsistency signals a lack of alignment between tactical messaging, public statements, and long-term strategy, creating uncertainty among allies, adversaries, and the general public. The disconnect is amplified by the rapid succession of statements through multiple channels, including social media, press briefings, and interviews. One day a tweet may frame the situation as a limited engagement with specific targets. The next a televised interview might suggest a broader, ongoing campaign with undefined endpoints. For observers and analysts, this pattern is more than confusing. It undermines confidence in the decision-making process. When those responsible for executing orders, managing diplomacy, and maintaining public support cannot rely on clear guidance from leadership, coordination becomes increasingly challenging. Military personnel may interpret ambiguous statements differently than policymakers, and allies may hesitate to align strategies when there is no clear vision of objectives. From a public perception standpoint, inconsistent communication has tangible consequences. Citizens attempt to make sense of a series of mixed messages by turning to news coverage, commentary, and speculation. In an era of fragmented media, where information spreads quickly and narratives are often shaped by interpretation as much as by fact, inconsistent messaging fuels uncertainty and mistrust. Observers often fill gaps in explanation with theories ranging from plausible strategic calculations to highly speculative conjecture. This is especially relevant when sensitive domestic issues, like the Epstein files, are coinciding with international events. The lack of a coherent message creates space for competing interpretations, some of which may undermine the administration's credibility or suggest alternative motives. Analysts in political communication and media studies emphasize that strategic messaging is integral to both domestic support and international diplomacy. Consistent communication signals control, preparation, and accountability, while disconnects suggest improvisation, reactionary decision-making, or even hidden agendas. In the case of the Iran conflict, the frequent shifts in rhetoric and framing have complicated the public's ability to understand the purpose, assess the progress, or evaluate the consequences of military decisions, leaving a vacuum that is rapidly filled by interpretation, speculation, and debate. Public and political criticism has played a major role in shaping the conversation around the Iran conflict, reflecting the frustration and skepticism many citizens, lawmakers, and commentators feel about both the rationale and the execution of the conflict. From the beginning, polls and media reports indicated that a significant portion of the population questioned whether military action was necessary, proportional, or strategically coherent. These reactions are not limited to one side of the political spectrum. Critics from across ideological lines have expressed concern about the lack of transparency, the shifting explanations for why the conflict began, and the unclear objectives for how it might end. The combination of inconsistent messaging, overlapping domestic controversies, and the high stakes of international engagement has amplified scrutiny, making it one of the most criticized foreign policy actions in recent memory. Political criticism often focuses on the decision-making process itself. Legislators, experts, and watchdog organizations have highlighted gaps in accountability, questioning whether congressional oversight was sufficient and whether national security advisors provided the necessary input before escalation. Some members of Congress have openly challenged the administration in public hearings, press conferences, and social media, emphasizing that the public deserves a clear, evidence-based explanation for initiating military action. Analysts point out that when the rationale for war is unclear or perceived as politically motivated, it not only undermines trust in leadership but also makes bipartisan support difficult, which can hinder effective governance and long-term strategic planning. Public criticism, meanwhile, reflects broader concerns about perception, transparency, and media framing. Citizens are increasingly aware of how timing and messaging can influence attention, particularly when major domestic controversies, the Epstein files, coincide with international crisis. Social media platforms, opinion pieces, and grassroots commentary have amplified voices that question the motives behind the conflict, creating a feedback loop where criticism becomes part of the news cycle itself. Public distrust can have real consequences, from decreased compliance with government policy to challenges in recruiting and sustaining military engagement to broader skepticism about international strategy. Analysts also note that criticism often revolves around the gap between rhetoric and reality. Promises of swift resolution, decisive action, or strategic clarity are frequently contrasted with reports of confusion, operational ambiguity, and shifting objectives. This mismatch fuels debate about whether leadership is guided by coherent policy, reactive impulses, or political calculations, reinforcing the perception that decisions may be influenced more by domestic optics than by long-term strategy. In the broader context of democratic governance, public and political criticism serves as a check on executive power, encouraging accountability, transparency, and deliberation, particularly when military action carries consequences that are global, immediate, and irreversible. When you look at the Iran conflict through all these lenses, unclear rationale, missing endgame, timing alongside the Epstein files, distraction theories, communication disconnects, and public criticism, one thing becomes clear: leadership isn't just about making decisions, it's about explaining them. Wars by their nature are high stakes, complicated, and consequential, but the way they are communicated shapes how they are understood, supported, and ultimately judged. When objectives are unclear, messaging is inconsistent, and timing overlaps with sensitive domestic controversies, perception can overshadow intent. People fill the gaps with speculation, criticism, and alternative narratives, and that becomes part of the story itself. Understanding this conflict requires not just following the headlines or tracking military movements, but critically analyzing the messages, the timing, and the patterns of explanation, or the lack thereof. It shows us that in politics, especially in matters of war, the story that is told can be just as influential as the events themselves, shaping public trust, accountability, and how history will remember the choices that were made.